A single banner flies against a rising shadow. This is the story of the Last House of Hador, a name whispered in fear and hope. Lord Aerion makes his choice, raising his family's ancient standard not in conquest, but in a final, desperate act of defiance. A creeping darkness has already swallowed the lands around him, and now it turns its hollow gaze upon his home. His people look to him, their own survival balanced on the edge of his sword. He seeks to reclaim a lost glory, but the cost of such pride could be the utter ruin of everything he holds dear. By the end of this tale, you will understand how a legacy can be shattered and then rebuilt into something stronger than stone. What does it truly take for a leader to save his people when the world itself seems to conspire against them? And I am curious, wherever you are in the world right now, what is the local time for you as you listen? The shadowed peaks watch and wait, holding their breath. What is the one choice you believe defines a true leader? Riders thundered from the gates, their mission clear yet fraught with peril. Aryan had sent his most loyal men to the farthest hills and the loneliest farmsteads, carrying his call to stand with the last House of Hador. He was summoning every soul who remembered the old allegiance to the fortress of Dor-Lómin. But trust, he would learn, is a frayed rope in a high wind. The first riders returned not with hopeful chieftains, but with troubling silence. They found empty villages, cold hearths, and doors left swinging in the wind. The few folk who remained spoke in hushed tones of a creeping dread, a mist that stole the warmth from the sun and the courage from the heart. These whispers slithered into the great hall of Dor-Lómin, chilling the air and turning old allies into hesitant strangers. Within his own council, Aryan faced a different kind of shadow. His advisors, men who had long guided his house with caution, urged a different path. They argued for barred gates and hidden stores, for waiting out the storm in silence. To raise the banner was to invite destruction, they warned. It was a plea for prudence, born of a deep and genuine fear. But Aryan stood before them, the weight of his lineage upon his shoulders. He heard their counsel, and then he overruled it. His voice did not shout, but it carried a finality that echoed in the stone chamber. Hador would not hide. Hador would stand, and Hador would fight. It was a choice that defined his reign not by its wisdom, but by its courage. That single decision, etched into the history of his house, was a beacon in the growing dark. And beacons are seen by friends and foes alike. By choosing open defiance, Aryan had drawn a line in the soil. He had made his fortress the one bright flame the shadow could not ignore. Far away, in deep and forgotten places, unseen agents took note. The gathering storm, once a distant threat, now had a destination. It began its slow, inexorable march toward the walls of Dor-Lómin. The silence of the waiting was shattered by the frantic shouts from the main gate. A lone rider, slumped over his saddle, was half carried into the courtyard. It was one of the Eastern scouts, his uniform torn and a dark stain spreading across his side. Lord Aerion did not wait for his guards, striding forward to catch the man as he fell. He laid the scout gently on the stones, his own hands pressing a cloak to the wound as he called for water and bandages. The man's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with a terror that was not from his injury alone. From inside his tunic, he produced a leather message tube, its wax seal cracked but still intact. Aryan broke it open and read the few stark lines. His face, a mask of stern command, grew pale. The message spoke of no army of soldiers, but of a crawling blight, a shadow that moved like a tide through the valleys. It did not march, it simply spread, and where it passed, the grass withered and the very stones grew cold. Their worst fears were not just confirmed, they were made real. As the healers worked, the scout's mind began to wander in a fever. He cried out about whispers in the air, voices that promised peace, if one would only stop fighting, stop hoping. He spoke of the wind itself, carrying a sickly sweet song that lulled the will to sleep. These ravings, overheard by the guards at the gate, spread through the fortress like a poison. The fear of a blade is one thing, but the fear of a thought, a sound that unravels your very spirit, is something else entirely. Morale, that fragile thread, began to fray. Aryan saw the doubt in his soldier's eyes. He stood, the blood-stained message crumpled in his fist, and his voice cut through the panicked murmurs. His orders were swift and left no room for question. Every bridge and ford across the river was to be barricaded and placed under constant watch. More urgently, he commanded the immediate evacuation of the outlying villages, the old, the young, the families who could not fight. They were to be brought within the high walls of the citadel. It was a stark choice, a retreat from the lands they were sworn to protect, but he prioritized the lives of his people over the dirt they stood upon. The cost of this defense would be immense, draining their stores and crowding their stronghold, but the threat was no longer potential. It was at their doorstep. By that evening, the first of the refugees began to arrive. They came with carts, piled high with their lives, their faces hollow with a loss that was more than material. They brought with them the same stories, tales of a quiet darkness that swallowed the light, and a deep, chilling silence where no bird sang. The great hall of Dor-Lómin felt more like a tomb than a council chamber. The air was thick with wood smoke and the scent of cold fear. Around a massive oak table, scarred by generations of use, Lord Aerion stood with his captains and the handful of allied chieftains who had risked everything to answer his call. Their faces were grim in the torchlight, their shadows dancing over a large, weathered map of the domain. This was the Council of Steel, and its decisions would determine if their people lived or died. The debate began with logic, but quickly frayed into raw emotion. One faction, led by veteran commanders, pointed at the fortress walls and argued for a defensive siege. They spoke of preserving their strength, of letting the enemy break upon their gates like a wave on the rocks. But every moment spent behind walls was a moment the creeping shadow tightened its grip on the land, strangling their hope along with their supply lines. Then came the opposing voice, loud and sharp as a sword leaving its scabbard. It was Aryan's own cousin, Baron, a young firebrand with a warrior's heart and a temper to match. He slammed his fist on the table, making the map jump. He called the siege plan a coward's death, a slow surrender to the dark. His eyes burned with a desperate need for glory as he demanded a preemptive strike, a massive cavalry charge to meet the enemy in the open field and break them with one glorious, decisive blow. The challenge was not just to the strategy, but to Aryan's authority itself. Baron's words hung in the air, a public test of his lord's resolve. All eyes turned to Aryan. He did not shout back. He looked from the grizzled defenders to his fiery cousin, weighing the desperation in both their pleas. He He saw the truth in each argument and the fatal flaw in each extreme. To do nothing was to wither. To throw everything into a single charge was to risk utter annihilation. In that tense silence, a third path took shape in his mind. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, a calm command that cut through the heated arguments. He would not choose one path over the other. He would attempt both. The main strength of their force would remain at Dor-Lómin, reinforcing the defenses and preparing for a long siege. But at the same time, he would authorize the formation of small, mobile ranger bands. These elite warriors would slip past the enemy's main body, using the land they knew so well to harass supply lines, ambush patrols, and gather vital intelligence. It was a compromise designed to appease both factions, but it was a dangerous one. A murmur of uneasy acceptance rippled through the council. The immediate threat of mutiny was quelled, but at a terrible cost. They were dividing their already outnumbered forces, a classic military error. If the main fortress was attacked while the rangers were away, they would be too weak to hold. If the rangers were caught and destroyed, they would lose their best scouts and most agile fighters for nothing. It was a gambit that relied on perfect timing and flawless execution from both groups, a nearly impossible standard to meet. As the council disbanded, Baron's simmering resentment was a palpable heat in the room. He had been denied his glorious charge, given command of a ranger band he saw as a raiding party, not an army. He looked at his cousin not with loyalty, but with a bitter disappointment that everyone present noted. Aryan had preserved his command, but he had sown a new seed of discord within his own walls, a weakness the encroaching shadow would surely exploit. The stone felt cold and gritty beneath Aryan's palms as he pressed another block into the gap in the outer wall. He worked in silence, his lord's tunic cast aside, his muscles straining alongside those of the common masons. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a necessity. The lower wards of Dor-Lómin were swollen with the displaced, a sea of anxious faces huddled around meager cookfires. He moved among them not as a distant ruler, but as a fellow survivor, his words simple and direct. He praised a woman for her tidy camp, helped an old man secure a flapping tent, and listened to the fears of a baker whose ovens had gone cold. Each small interaction was a thread, weaving a stronger bond between the Lord and his folk. His presence was a quiet argument against despair. Then he saw the children. A small boy, clutching a wooden sword, stared up at the battlements with wide, unblinking eyes. In that child's face, Aryan did not see innocence, but a reflection of the dread that threatened to consume them all. It was in that moment the weight truly settled upon him. His decisions were no longer abstract points of strategy on a map. They were the very breath in that child's lungs. Later, in the smoky heat of the armory, he gave a quiet order to the master smith. There would be no grand pronouncement. Using the last of their reserved iron, the smiths were to begin forging simple medallions, each stamped with the stoic hawk of Hador. It was a token meant for every man and woman who would stand on the walls, a physical reminder that they were not merely soldiers, but one house, one family. This act solidified their loyalty, transforming a population of refugees into a community of defenders, but it also sharpened the stakes to a piercing point. Every life was now a story he knew, a face he recognized, a loss that would feel like a personal failure. As the last medallion was struck, a single horn blast echoed from the highest tower. The enemy's vanguard had been sighted, a dark smudge gathering at the distant river. From the high walls, the first clash was a distant, silent dance of violence. A sudden flash of sunlight on steel betrayed Baron's charge, a furious, beautiful, and utterly foolish attack on the enemy vanguard at the river crossing. He had taken his rangers and a score of hot-blooded volunteers, ignoring the council's plan for a full defensive posture. For a few glorious moments, it seemed his gamble would pay off. The horsemen crashed into the disorganized ranks at the water's edge, scattering them like leaves in a storm. Cheers erupted along the battlements, but the cheers died in their throats as the scene unfolded. The enemy, far from breaking, simply flowed around Baron's small force. They were not an army to be routed by a single charge, but a living shadow that absorbed the blow and then closed in, cutting off any path of retreat. The distant dance became a slaughter, a slow, grim tightening of a noose. Aryan watched, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone parapet. The choice before him was a torturous one, a perfect trap of duty and heart. To hold the fortress was his primary command, to conserve his strength for the main assault he knew was coming, but to abandon his own blood, his cousin, to die in a field of his own making, felt like a betrayal of everything their house stood for. Every second of his hesitation cost more lives down by the river. He could see the bright banners of Hador falling, one by one. The weight of lordship demanded he sacrifice a few to save the many, but the weight of kinship screamed in refusal. His decision, when it came, was not a shout but a low, grim order. He would not commit his main infantry or cavalry that would be playing into the enemy's hands. Instead, he sent for the reserve archers, their quivers filled with the last of the good, fletched arrows. They were to take position on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the far bank. Their mission was not to win the battle, but to create a momentary screen, a hail of shafts to distract the encircling force just long enough for the survivors to break free. It was a desperate, costly gamble, spending a precious resource for a slim chance at saving the doomed. The flight of arrows darkened the sky for a brief moment, a deadly rain that gave the trapped men a sliver of an opening. They fought their way back toward the river in a bloody, chaotic scramble, leaving many of their comrades behind in the churned mud. When the survivors finally staggered back through the gates, they brought with them a grievously wounded baron and the bitter taste of a pointless victory. They had bloodied the enemy's nose, but at a terrible price. The military setback was immediate. They had lost experienced fighters and horses they could not replace. More critically, the rescue had depleted their strategic reserve of arrows, a resource that would be desperately needed when the true assault began. The enemy host, now fully assembled and tested, began its advance in earnest, their silent, relentless march a far greater threat than any reckless charge. Impulsive valor had proven to be their greatest liability, and the true siege was about to begin. The stars vanished, not behind clouds, but behind a ring of enemy watchfires that coiled around the fortress like a serpent of flame. The siege of Dor-Lómin had begun in earnest. By day, the air filled with the sounds of distant hammers and the groaning of wood as the Shadow's forces constructed their siege towers and catapults. By night, a new sound took hold, a low, ceaseless drumming that pulsed through the very stones, a rhythm that seemed to sap the warmth from a person's bones. It was a sound meant to unravel the mind, and it was working. Fights broke out in the mess lines over scraps of bread, and sentries on the wall would snap at their own shadows, their nerves frayed to breaking point. Aryon's response was swift and practical. He knew a fortress could fall from the inside long before its walls were breached. He instituted a rigid watch schedule, giving every able-bodied person a purpose, a task that anchored them to the present moment. He organized work crews not just for repairs, but for cleaning, for mending gear, for anything that would keep hands busy and minds focused. He walked the crowded wards constantly, his presence a calm counterpoint to the pervasive dread. He understood that idleness was a poison, and despair was its favorite companion, yet the physical toll was inescapable. Rationing of food and clean water began immediately, turning a hearty meal into a memory. The first deaths were not from enemy arrows, but from a fever that spread through the lower wards, a sickness born of crowding and poor sanitation. Each small funeral pyre, burning within the walls, made the conflict brutally, intimately real. This was no longer a story of glorious battle, but a grim test of endurance. Then, one evening, as the drumming reached a fever pitch, a new sound cut through the din. It was a shriek, high and thin, not of any beast they knew, but something that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air itself. It was a sound that promised not just death, but a complete and utter unmaking. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise itself. The oppressive drumming seemed to seep into the very stones of the citadel, a constant vibration that frayed nerves and clouded thought. It was in the deepest hours of a moonless night that Alara, the Lord's own sister, found her answer. While others sought rest she could not find, she retreated to the one place where silence still held dominion, the cavernous citadel library. There, by the guttering light of a single candle, her fingers traced the crumbling leather of a scroll, so old its language was nearly forgotten. She was not searching for battle plans, but for a whisper of something older than steel, a memory of light from a time before the shadow fell. The words she deciphered spoke of a heartstone, a relic not of power, but of pure, unconquered light, said to have been forged in the earliest days when the world was young. It was a legend, a fireside tale told to comfort frightened children, but in that moment, to Alara, it felt like the only truth left in the world. She brought her discovery to the War Council at first light, her voice quiet but unwavering. The reaction was a storm of grim practicality. How could they spare warriors for a hunt through myth? Their commander argued, when the enemy's siege towers were nearly complete. Another councilman scoffed, calling it a fantasy that would only lead good men to their deaths for nothing more than a pretty rock. The debate was sharp, pitting the cold, hard reality of their dwindling supplies and thinning ranks against the fragile, desperate hope of a miracle. Aryan listened to every word, his gaze moving from the strained faces of his captains to the serene certainty in his sister's eyes. He saw the divide clearly, one path leading to a slow, certain end behind their own walls, the other to a wild, improbable chance. His decision, when it came, was made not as a general, but as a man who understood that a fortress without hope is already fallen. He would not commit his army, but he would place a wager on faith. He gave Alara his blessing to assemble a small, trusted party, warriors and scouts, known for their stealth and resilience, and tasked them with the impossible, to find the fabled Heartstone. The choice was a terrible gamble. To send his best rangers and his own sister beyond the walls was to willingly weaken their defenses at the most critical hour. Every person in that quest party was a blade that would not be on the wall when the final assault came. Their mission was a secret, a spark of hope they dared not show the people, for if that spark were extinguished in the darkness beyond, the resulting despair would be more devastating than any enemy battering ram. The weight of that knowledge settled on Aryan as he watched the small group prepare in a secluded courtyard. They were not an army, just 7 souls clad in dark, muted cloaks, their faces set with a resolve that mirrored his own. They carried little, just enough for a swift journey. Their only map the ancient words on Alara's scroll. As the deepest part of the night embraced the fortress, a single, well-oiled postern gate swung open without a sound. One by one, the figures slipped through the narrow opening, vanishing into the shadows between the enemy watchfires like ghosts. Their departure left the citadel feeling emptier, its fate now irrevocably split, resting on the strength of its walls and the faith of a few hearts, searching for a light in the overwhelming dark. The foul stench hit them first, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. It came from the central well in the lower courtyard, the heart of the fortress's water supply. When the first bucket was drawn at dawn, the water was not clear, but clouded with a swirling, oily darkness that shimmered with a sickly rainbow sheen. The panic was immediate and visceral. Within hours, the line outside the healers' tents stretched across the yard. Strong men and women were suddenly racked with fever, their skin clammy, their minds drifting into delirium. The healers, already stretched thin from the earlier sickness, were utterly overwhelmed, their supplies of cleansing herbs dwindling to nothing. This was not a wound one could stitch. It was a poison that seeped into the community itself. Fear, sharper than any sword, began to divide them. Whispers turned into shouts. The newcomers, the refugees who had sought shelter within their walls, were suddenly viewed with suspicious eyes. They were strangers, outsiders who might have smuggled in the very corruption that now threatened to destroy them all. A fistfight broke out near the granary between a lifelong guardsman and a farmer from the eastern valleys, the tension exploding into raw violence. The community Aryan had worked so hard to build was fracturing before his eyes, torn apart by a terror more effective than any siege engine. Aryan moved through the chaos with a grim stillness. He listened to the accusations. He saw the fear in the eyes of his own people and the terrified confusion in the faces of the refugees. He knew that words alone would not mend this breach. His decision was one of profound personal risk. He ordered a new, deep well dug in a secluded inner courtyard, its location known only to a few, and its access heavily guarded by his most loyal men. When the first pure water was drawn, he did not order a taster. Instead, before the assembled anxious crowd, he took the filled dipper himself. He drank it down in one long, slow draught, his eyes locked on his people. He then walked directly into the healer's tent, ignoring the risk of contagion, and took up a cloth to cool the brow of a sick child. He did not command from a distance. He shared the danger and the hardship. This act of solidarity quelled the immediate mutiny, but the cost was written on his face. The days of strain, the sleepless nights, and now the shared sacrifice began to wear him down. The strong set of his shoulders softened with a new, deep weariness. He was fighting a war on three fronts now, against the enemy at the gates, the poison in their veins, and the despair in their hearts. The shadow was no longer just outside, it was within, and its most cunning weapon was the doubt it sowed between them. A feverish delirium was Baron's only companion in the healer's ward. The shame of his failure at the river was a poison sharper than any wound, and it gnawed at him even in his sleep. It was during one restless night, his mind drifting between pain and waking, that he overheard it. Two guards stationed outside his door, their voices low and trembling, were not discussing the enemy's movements, but their own desperate plan. They spoke of a small, unguarded postern gate on the northern wall, a forgotten passage they believed could be their salvation. They meant to open it, to offer a token surrender to the shadow in the desperate hope it would spare their lives. A cold clarity cut through Baron's fever. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest, and moved through the dimly lit corridors with a singular, grim purpose. He found them in a storage room near the very gate they had described, 5 men huddled around a single lantern. Their faces were not those of traitors, but of broken men, their eyes hollow with a fear that had eaten away their courage. The leader, a grizzled sergeant Baron had once trained with, looked up in shocked guilt. The tension in the room was a drawn wire. Baron stood between them and the heavy iron bolt, his own sword still in its scabbard. He was outnumbered and weakened, but his presence filled the small space. The sergeant pleaded with him, his voice cracking. He spoke of his children, of the pointless death that awaited them all, of the slow, suffocating dread that made any risk seem better than this waiting. Baron looked at these men, his own people, and faced an impossible choice. To cut them down where they stood would be to save the fortress from certain betrayal, but it would be to murder men driven to the edge by the very terror he had helped unleash with his own recklessness. To let them pass, however, would be to doom every soul within Dor-Lómin, including the sergeant's own children. In that suspended moment, he understood the true burden of command, a weight far heavier than any sword. He did not draw his blade. Instead, he took a step forward, his voice low and ragged, but firm. He told them he understood their fear, that he too had been blinded by it. But he would not let their despair be the end of their house. He ordered them to stand down, to relinquish their weapons. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the sergeant would refuse, his hand twitching toward his hilt. But something in Baron's eyes, a newfound depth of sorrow and resolve, made him hesitate. The man's will broke, and he dropped his sword with a clatter. The others followed. Baron did not kill them. He had them disarmed and marched to the citadel's cells, arguing to the shocked guards who arrived that it was fear, not malice, that had moved them. This act of mercy, from the once impetuous warrior, began to mend the fractured trust within the fortress. When Aryan heard the full account, the cold distance between the cousins finally began to thaw, replaced by a grim, hard-won respect. But the effort had cost Baron dearly. He collapsed as the prisoners were led away, his wounds reopened and bleeding, his body pushed past its limits. As he was carried back to the healers, the first heavy thud of a siege engine's projectile smashed against the main gate, a brutal reminder that the time for internal strife was over. The final assault had truly begun. The sound was not just an impact, but a deep, groaning tear that shuddered through the very foundations of Dor-Lómin. A section of the outer curtain wall, ancient stone that had stood for 1,000 years, dissolved into a cloud of dust and rubble. Through that newly opened mouth, the enemy poured a silent, relentless tide of shadow and steel. The battle was no longer a distant exchange of arrows. It was here, in the streets, in the courtyards, a brutal and intimate struggle for every inch of ground. Aryan was already there, his banner a bright rallying point in the choking dust. He did not command from the rear, he fought in the very front rank, his sword a blur as he met the first wave, crashing through the breach. His life was measured in the space between heartbeats, each parry and thrust a desperate gamble to hold the line. He became a force of nature, a storm of defiance where the wall had once been. But for every foe he cut down, 3 more took its place. The tide was simply too great. In a moment of grim clarity, amid the screaming and the clash of arms, he made the most agonizing decision of his life. He bellowed the order for a full retreat to the inner keep. He was sacrificing the outer city, the homes and workshops of his people, to preserve the final, fortified heart of his domain. His guards formed a shield wall around him, fighting a slow, bloody withdrawal through streets they had known since childhood, now choked with smoke and terror. As the last of his soldiers scrambled across the drawbridge and the massive iron portcullis of the inner citadel slammed down, the reality of their situation became terrifyingly clear. They had lost over half their territory. The outer wards were now a hunting ground for the enemy, and everyone who remained alive was crammed into the overcrowded inner keep. The air grew thick with the breath of too many people in too small a space, and the already strict rationing of food and water became a countdown to starvation. The hope for Alara and her quest party, once a distant dream, now felt like the single, frayed thread from which all their lives were suspended. The air in the High Council chamber was thick with more than just wood smoke. It was heavy with suspicion, a new poison that had seeped into the heart of their last refuge. Alara found her brother alone, staring into the cold hearth, and her voice was barely a whisper as she described the vision that had come to her in a moment of quiet focus. She had seen a figure, cloaked and hooded, standing at a high arrow slit overlooking the enemy camps. No torch was lit, but a small, polished piece of metal in their hand had caught the distant firelight, flashing a deliberate sequence of signals into the night. The figure was one of the High Council. A traitor was among them, a serpent in the very bosom of their trust. The revelation struck Aryan with a force greater than any battering ram. His own advisors, the men and women with whom he had shared every fear and every desperate plan, were no longer a united front. He looked at the empty chairs around the table and saw not allies, but masks. Was it the cautious master of stores, who always argued for conservation, the grim captain of the guard, who reported every minor setback with a strange satisfaction, the grief-stricken elder whose family had been lost in the overrun villages? Paranoia, cold and insidious, began to coil around his thoughts. To voice this accusation openly would be to unleash a witch hunt that would shatter the fragile unity they had fought so hard to preserve. It would turn friend against friend, and in their desperation, the innocent might be torn apart by the mob. He could not risk it, and so he made a choice that isolated him further. He sent for the one person he now believed was above suspicion, the one whose loyalty had been tested in the crucible of his own failure, his cousin Baron. In the privacy of the map room, Aryan laid out the terrible suspicion. Baron, still pale from his wounds, listened in grim silence, the old fire in his eyes replaced by a cold, hard understanding. The plan they devised was a delicate and dangerous thing. They would set a trap with false information as the bait. Aryan would call a full council meeting and speak of a critical, hidden weakness, a forgotten sewage conduit on the northeastern wall that was being secretly reinforced as a potential escape route. Only the council members would hear this lie. If the traitor existed, they would surely try to signal this vital intelligence to the enemy. They positioned Baron and his most trusted rangers in the dark, ruined buildings of the outer ward, their eyes fixed on the high arrow slits of the inner keep. The stakes of this gamble were terrifying. If they were wrong, they were wasting precious resources and sowing the very discord they feared. If the traitor was clever enough to see through the ruse, they would know their cover was blown and become even more dangerous. But the greatest cost was to Aryan's own spirit, to look into the faces of the men and women he had relied upon for years and wonder which one was a knife waiting for his back, that was a shadow that no torch could dispel. His faith in his own judgment, the very core of his leadership, was shaken to its foundation. As night fell and the council meeting adjourned, the trap was set. All they could do now was wait in the oppressive dark, hoping to catch a glint of betrayal in the moonlight. The single flash of a lantern from the high window was a silent scream of betrayal. Baron's signal, a low owl's hoot, echoed across the ruined ward, and within moments, his rangers had seized Lord Valandil. The master of stores offered no resistance, his face a pale mask of resignation as they dragged him before the council. Under the grim, silent stares of his peers, his carefully constructed composure crumbled. He confessed not for power or hatred, but for a desperate, twisted love. He believed with every fiber of his being that Aryan's defiance was a death sentence for them all. By feeding the enemy information, he hoped to force a swift surrender, a bitter peace that might, just might, spare his wife and young son from the slaughter he was certain was coming. His was a treason born of fear, not malice, a poison distilled from the very same dread that choked them all. Aryan's council chamber became a court of raw emotion. Some, their faces hard with the memory of friends lost at the breached wall, demanded immediate execution. A public death was the only way to purify their honor and deter any other would-be traitors. Others, their voices trembling with a reluctant pity, argued for imprisonment. To kill a man for trying to save his family, however wrongly, felt like a step into the same darkness that besieged them. The fate of their house now hinged on a single judgment, a decision that would define its soul in its final hours. Aryan listened, his own heart a battlefield. He saw the logic in the sword, the cold necessity of it, but he also saw Valandil's son, a boy who had followed him with wide, admiring eyes just days before. To spill more Hador blood, even that of a traitor, felt like a victory for the shadow. His verdict, when it came, was as harsh as the winter wind, yet it held a sliver of mercy. He would not be their executioner. By the ancient laws of their house, the penalty for treason was exile. Valandil, his wife, and his son would be cast out. They would be given a single day's ration of water and food, stripped of their insignia, and sent through the postern gate into the lands now held by the enemy. It was a sentence that upheld the law without staining their hands with kin blood, a clemency that felt crueler than any blade. Many saw it not as mercy, but as a protracted death sentence, a condemnation to be hunted and torn apart by the very forces Valandil had sought to appease. As the small, forlorn family was led away into the dawn's gray light, a heavy silence fell over the citadel. Justice had been served, but it left a stain of profound unease. If a man as steadfast as Valandil could be broken, who among them was truly safe from despair's corruption? The enemy, however, did not mourn their lost spy. Their response was swift and terrifyingly final. The constant drumming ceased, replaced by an unnerving quiet. From the walls, Aryan scouts reported a new, massive structure being assembled in the enemy camp. A siege tower, taller than any they had seen, its dark timbers seeming to drink the morning light. The disappearance of their informant had not caused hesitation. It had merely prompted the shadow to abandon subtlety. They were gathering their full strength for one overwhelming, decisive blow. The brief, bitter drama of the traitor was over. The final act of the siege was about to begin, and the stage was set for ruin. The silence broke with a roar that shook the very stones of the inner keep. The final assault was not a wave. It was a storm of fang and shadow and sorcerous fire. Corrupted beasts, their forms twisted and eyes burning with a mindless hunger, scrambled over the barricades, while from the darkness behind them came blasts of sickly green energy that shattered stone and scattered men like leaves. The fighting dissolved into 100 desperate struggles in every corridor and courtyard, a brutal, house-to-house slaughter where the grand strategy of lords meant nothing. In the heart of the chaos, the Great Banner of Hador, the stoic hawk that had flown for generations, was ripped from its standard by a clawed limb and trampled into the blood-soaked mud. Its fall felt like the death of hope itself. It was in this maelstrom that Aryan and Baron found themselves driven together, their backs against a splintered doorway. There was no time for words of forgiveness, only the shared language of survival: parry, thrust, and strike. Baron's reckless fury was now a controlled, efficient violence, protecting his lord's flank. Aryan's commanding presence was a rock against which the shadows broke. Their personal reconciliation was forged not in conversation, but in the fire of battle, a bond of trust, hammered out on the anvil of their shared desperation. Yet for every beast they felled, 2 more took its place. The line was buckling, the defenders being pushed back step by bloody step into the heart of their own home. Aryan's voice, hoarse from shouting and smoke, cut through the din with a final, terrible order: fall back to the great hall. It was the last defensible position, the final room in the House of Hador. This was the end of all conventional defense. The next hour would decide if their name lived on or was erased from the world forever, as the battered remnants of his house fought a frantic retreat through the familiar hallways. A strange, soft light flickered on the distant horizon, a single, unwavering point of gold in the overwhelming dark. A golden star bloomed in the heart of the enemy's darkness. From the chaos of the rear flank, a handful of ragged figures erupted, led by a single ranger who held aloft a stone that pulsed with a soft, unwavering light. It was Alara's quest party, returned from the jaws of myth itself. The Heartstone's radiance was not a weapon of fire, but of pure, unconquered memory. Where its light fell, the corrupted beast shrieked and recoiled, as if touched by scalding iron, their forms wavering like mist in a sudden sun. The relentless pressure on the defenders broke for one precious, impossible moment. But the miracle was drenched in sacrifice. Of the 7 who had left, only 3 now stood, their armor in tatters and their eyes hollow with a grief too profound for words. They had bought this chance with the blood of their companions, a price etched forever in their weary stance. Aryan did not hesitate. His voice, though raw, cut through the stunned silence with the force of a hammer on an anvil. He called not just to his soldiers, but to every soul who could hold a tool or a kitchen knife. This was their one chance, their final roll of the dice. He rallied them around the glowing stone, making it the beating heart of a new, desperate formation. The tide of the battle turned not with a slow grind, but with a violent, sudden lurch. The defenders, moments from being crushed, now surged forward with a strength born of absolute necessity, using the pocket of safety created by the relic to push back the disoriented enemy. Yet even as they advanced, a terrible truth became clear. The Heartstone's light was not eternal. It flickered, its golden glow dimming for a heartbeat before flaring again, like a candle fighting a strong wind. They were not wielding an infinite power, but a dying ember. Their counterattack was a race against the fading of that light, a single, desperate chance to break the siege before the darkness closed in for good. The golden light of the Heartstone began to gutter like a dying candle. In that flickering uncertainty, a new horror emerged from the enemy ranks. A single figure, cloaked in shifting shadows that drank the light, raised a hand. Where its fingers pointed, the very air screamed, and a dozen of Aryan's defenders simply unraveled, their forms dissolving into mist. This was the mastermind of the siege, the central command that gave the shadow its cruel intelligence. Aryan knew in his bones that this was the final, vital target. To reach it, however, was an impossible charge through a wall of fang and claw. Baron saw it too, and in that shared glance, an entire conversation passed between the cousins. There was no time for farewells, only a final, unspoken understanding. With a raw cry that was part defiance, part farewell, Baron did not charge the sorcerer. Instead, he turned his blade on the corrupted beasts, guarding the sorcerer's flanks, drawing their frenzied attention, and more importantly, the sorcerer's own gaze. He made himself the most immediate, the most infuriating threat. It was a brilliant, brutal distraction. A blast of dark energy meant for Aryan instead slammed into Baron, throwing him back, his armor smoking. But he rose again and again, a stumbling, bleeding beacon that held the enemy's focus. Aryan was forced to watch, his path to the sorcerer now clear, his heart tearing in two. He saw the moment the sorcerer, enraged by this stubborn, dying man, took a step forward to personally extinguish the nuisance. It was the mistake Baron had paid for with his life. As the dark figure loomed over his fallen cousin, Aryan's grief became a weapon. Tears streamed through the grime on his face, but his sword arm was steady. He did not roar, he did not shout. He moved with a silence more terrifying than any battle cry. His final strike was not a move of elegant swordsmanship, but a raw, cleaving arc fueled by a shattered heart and a renewed, terrible will to protect the few who remained. The sorcerer fell, and with its death, a psychic shockwave ripped through the enemy host. The silent coordination that had bound them shattered. Beasts turned on each other. The shadows lost their cohesion. and the army dissolved into a chaotic, leaderless mob. The siege was broken. As the first rays of the sun crested the shattered walls, they illuminated a scene of utter desolation. The victory was real, but it felt like ash in the mouth. They had paid for this dawn with the blood of kin, with the near total ruin of their home, and with the life of the man who had finally, truly, come home. The silence after a battle is a heavier burden than the noise of fighting. Aryan stood in the ruined shell of his great hall, the morning light revealing the full cost of their survival. His gaze fell upon the banner of Hador, its proud hawk, torn and trampled into the blood-stained stone and mud. He did not call for a new standard to be raised in triumph. Instead, he knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, and gathered the tattered cloth into his hands. One by one, the survivors emerged from the shadows, drawn not by a speech, but by the quiet intensity of their lord's action. They watched in a hushed circle as he sat upon a broken block of masonry and began to mend the tears. His large, sword-calloused hands, so recently instruments of death, now worked a needle and thread with a fragile, heartbreaking care. This was not a gesture of victory, but one of profound repair. The urge to cheer their deliverance died in their throats, choked by the memory of the pyres already burning in the courtyard and the empty spaces where friends and family should have stood. The monumental task of rebuilding stretched before them, a mountain of grief and rubble that seemed utterly impossible to climb. When Aryan finally spoke, his voice was rough with exhaustion, but it carried through the stillness. He told them that the House of Hador would not be remembered for its fall, nor for the glory it once held. It would be remembered for this moment, for the choice to pick up the pieces. They would rebuild, he declared, but not as they were before. There would be no more high lords in sealed keeps and common folk in the lower wards. They were one people now, bound by shared loss and shared survival. Their strength would lie not in stone walls or ancient lineages, but in the resilience they had discovered within themselves. The battle for their lives was over, but the deeper, more difficult work of healing their spirit and reforging their very identity from the ashes had only just begun. The first council meeting was not held in the scarred Great Hall, but in the open air of the main courtyard, amidst the scent of damp stone and new timber. When the last of the surviving lords arrived, expecting to take their accustomed seats, they found no chairs waiting for them. Instead, Aryan stood before a gathering that included a blacksmith with soot-stained hands, a farmer whose family had tilled the valley soil for generations, and the young healer's apprentice who had tirelessly tended the wounded. He announced without ceremony the dissolution of the old noble council. In its place, he was forming a new body, a council of the people. Every voice that had endured the siege, from the highest captain to the lowliest kitchen servant, would now have a representative. A stunned silence fell, followed by a wave of murmurs that was part hope and part outrage. The old order, already cracked by the war, now shattered completely. One white-bearded lord, whose family name was older than the fortress itself, sputtered in disbelief. He argued that this was chaos, an insult to the lineage and tradition that had built Dor-Lómin. To place a farmer's opinion on equal footing with a lord's, he claimed, was to spit upon the graves of their ancestors and invite anarchy. His words were a final, desperate grasp for a world that was already ash. Aryan listened, his gaze sweeping over the diverse faces of the new assembly. His reply was quiet, but carried the weight of recent memory. He asked the old lord if tradition had stopped the enemy's sorcery at the gate. He asked if noble blood alone had hauled water or forged the medallions they wore. The siege had taught him a brutal, fundamental truth, that a community is not a pyramid with a lord at its peak, but a wall where every stone, regardless of its shape or origin, must bear its share of the load for the whole to stand. His decision was final. This new council was not a suggestion. It was the law of their survival. The immediate consequence was a surge of energy and ingenuity that the old, insular council could never have produced. The farmer, who knew the land's drainage better than any map, proposed a new layout for the fields that would prevent soil erosion. The blacksmith, working with the healers, designed a more efficient bellows system for the sick wards to keep the air clean. For the first time, the people rebuilding the walls were the same people who had designed them, and their loyalty was now deeply, personally invested in the success of the new Dor-Lómin. Yet, as the first rough sketches of their new home were drawn with a stick in the damp earth, a new kind of tension simmered. The very act of giving everyone a voice meant that those voices would not always agree. Alliances began to form, not along bloodlines, but along practical needs. The farmers arguing for more land allocation, the crafters for more raw materials. They were no longer unified solely against an external enemy, but were learning to navigate the complex and often messy landscape of shared governance. Aryan had traded the clear, vertical chain of command for a horizontal web of collaboration, a structure that was far more resilient, but also far more difficult to control. The work of cleansing their land was a battle as grueling as the siege itself. Aryan led the first work parties out from the shattered gates, not with swords, but with shovels and axes. They moved through a world wounded by shadow, where the very earth was stained a sickly gray, and the trees stood as brittle, leafless skeletons. The air in these places was still and cold, carrying a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. This was not a simple cleanup. It was a physical and spiritual purification. They found entire fields that were utterly blighted, patches of ground where the soil had turned to a fine, black dust that refused to hold a single seed. Standing at the edge of one such vast, dead expanse, the council faced its first great internal divide. Some, their spirits already worn thin by loss, argued passionately for abandoning these cursed places. They spoke of green valleys to the south, untouched by the war, where the soil was rich and the water ran clear. Why waste a generation trying to revive a corpse when a new life waited just beyond the mountains? The temptation to simply walk away from the pain was immense, but Aryan stood firm, his boots sinking into the poisoned soil. He told them that a home is not just a place you find, but a place you make. To leave this land to its blight would be to grant the shadow a final, lasting victory. It would mean that everything they had endured, every life they had lost, would have been for nothing. His decision was an act of defiant hope. He ordered a great pit to be dug in the center of the worst field, and into it they hauled the scorched stones from the fallen walls and the splintered timbers of their old homes. Then, from a shielded casket, he brought a single, precious acorn, saved from a tree that had burned in the outer courtyard. He planted it with his own hands in that memorial soil, a tiny, vulnerable promise in a sea of despair. The labor that followed was backbreaking and soul-crushing. Each day brought fresh discouragement, a blighted spring they had missed, a patch of earth that seemed to resist all their efforts. The work was also dangerous, for remnants of the shadow still lingered in forgotten corners, twisted creatures that would lash out at the unsuspecting. Morale frayed with every passing week that showed no progress. The fate of their entire endeavor hung in the balance, dependent on this agonizingly slow reclamation. Were they truly rebuilding a home, or were they merely lingering as caretakers in a vast, open graveyard? Then, one morning, a shout echoed across the field. A young girl, the daughter of the blacksmith, was on her knees, pointing at the base of the memorial cairn. There, where the light of the heartstone had been concentrated during the final ritual of cleansing, a fragile hint of green had pushed through the gray earth. It was not the oak, but a simple, stubborn blade of grass. In that single, vibrant sign of life, the will of the people found its roots, and the long winter of their spirit finally began to thaw. The forge fire's heat felt like a memory of the old world, but the work being done there was entirely new. Ilara stood beside the master smith, their faces illuminated not just by the coals, but by a shared, quiet triumph. Between them, draped across a heavy wooden bench, lay the new standard of House Hador. It was a tapestry of their entire story. The base was the original banner, its proud hawk still visible, but now artfully mended with stitches of a dozen different threads, some fine silk, others coarse wool, all taken from the cloaks and tunics of the survivors. Woven over this patched history was a new emblem, hammered from a single piece of bright steel, a green enameled shoot defiantly rising from the center of a broken shield. It was not a symbol of untarnished glory, but of life persisting through fracture. When they presented it to Aryan, the courtyard fell silent. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the cool metal of the green shoot, then the rough, mended fabric beneath it. A profound understanding passed across his face. This was not a rejection of their past, but its honest evolution. He did not need to ask the crowd for their opinion. Their collective, held breath was answer enough, a wave of approval that was felt more than heard. This new sigil was theirs, a visual story of their shared pain and their stubborn hope. Yet from the edges of the crowd, a different sound emerged, a low murmur of dissent. A handful of the older lords, their postures rigid, looked upon the banner with something akin to grief. One of them, Lord Aerion, whose ancestors had served Hador for centuries, stepped forward, his voice tight with emotion. He did not shout, but his words carried a sharp, mournful edge. "You erase the hawk," he said, "the very symbol that flew when this house was great. You mix our noble standard with the common cloth of peasants, and patch it with a gardener's emblem. This is not strength, this is surrender. It is the dilution of our very soul." The challenge hung in the air, a final plea for the world that was lost. All eyes turned to Aryan. He did not dismiss the old lord's pain. He acknowledged it with a slow nod, but then his gaze swept over the smith, the farmer, the healer, all the faces that had become his new counsel. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and carried the weight of hard-earned truth. The hawk was a symbol of a house that lived behind high walls and looked down from a height, he declared. It was a glorious symbol, but it was not enough to save us. Our strength now is not in our unsullied history, but in our mended scars. It is in our unity, our adaptability, this green shoot that insists on life, even when the world is broken. We are not diluting our heritage, We are fulfilling its true purpose, to endure. With that, he took the new standard himself and led the procession to the rebuilt gatehouse. The act of raising the new banner was a quiet, solemn ceremony. As the wind caught the cloth, making the green shoot seem to tremble with life against the mended field of the old hawk, the cultural shift Aryan had championed was made permanent. They were no longer the last House of Hador, clinging to a faded dream. They were the first house of the mended shield, and they had fully, irrevocably, committed to the difficult, beautiful work of becoming something new. The first sheaves of grain were cut not with a scythe, but with a ceremonial sickle, its blade polished to a soft gleam. The entire community stood at the edge of the field, watching as the farmer who had proposed the new drainage system made that initial, careful cut. The stalks fell with a rustle that sounded like a promise kept. The harvest was modest, a yield of pale grain and hardy tubers from a field that had been a blighted scar just months before, but its symbolic weight was immense. This was not food scavenged or saved from the old stores. This was life drawn anew from a land they had personally coaxed back from the dead. For the first time since the siege, the specter of starvation truly retreated, replaced by the profound security of a full storehouse. Yet as the last sacks were carried in, a familiar shadow began to stir. Whispers started in the line, forming outside the granary, old fears and older instincts bubbling to the surface. A few of the original fortress guards, men accustomed to the privileges of their station, began to murmur that those who had done the hardest labor, the fighting and the heavy rebuilding, deserved a larger share. It was a quiet argument for a return to the old ways, a system of rank and reward that felt comfortable and known. The new council faced its first true test of power, and it was not on a battlefield, but over a pile of potatoes. Aryan listened to the debate in the council circle, hearing the fear disguised as reason. He saw the danger immediately, that this single harvest could reseed the very divisions that had nearly destroyed them. His decision was swift and left no room for negotiation. He stood before the gathered people, the council members arrayed behind him, and decreed that the harvest would be shared according to one principle alone: need. A family with many children would receive more than a single laborer. The elderly and the infirm would have their portion guaranteed. This was not a reward for past service, but an investment in their collective future. The council itself, a body that now included a cook and a carpenter, would oversee the distribution to ensure its fairness. This act of radical equity transformed their society more than any battle ever had. It cemented a new, unbreakable social contract, a tangible understanding that every person's well-being was tied to the others. The act of sharing this hard-won food fostered a powerful sense of shared destiny, a mutual care that became the strongest stone in their rebuilt home. Hope was no longer a fragile idea, but something you could hold in your hand, something that filled your belly and strengthened your resolve for the work still to come. The scent of wood smoke and turned earth was broken by the sharp cry of a horn from the watchtower. Two riders approached under a flag of truce, their armor and banners unlike any the sentries had ever seen. They were emissaries from a kingdom across the southern mountains, a realm that had watched the shadows advance with dread and its sudden, inexplicable collapse with awe. They had come seeking the source of that miracle, drawn by rumors of a people who had not only survived the darkness, but had broken its back. Their arrival was the first tangible proof that Dor-Lómin was no longer a forgotten ruin, but a name spoken with respect in distant courts. The messengers brought no demands, only offers, proposals for trade routes, and a mutual defense pact. They recognized the unique, hardened strength that had been forged in the fires of the siege, a resilience more valuable than any army of untested soldiers. Yet as the strangers were led through the rebuilt gates, a cold unease spread among the survivors. In the communal dining hall that evening, the air was thick with more than the smell of stew. An older mason, his hands still scarred from moving stones, stood and voiced the fear gripping many. "We bled to be free of one master," he argued, his voice rough with emotion. "Why invite another? They will draw us into their wars, and our children will die on foreign soil for a king we have never met." Others whispered of their hard-won harvest, fearing it would be taxed away to feed distant cities. The old instinct to bar the gates and trust no one was a powerful force, a defensive wall built in the mind that was harder to dismantle than any made of stone. Aryan listened to these fears with a grave respect. He understood the profound value of what they had built in their isolation, a society based on shared need and trust. But he also saw the larger picture, one the farmer and the mason, focused on their own fields and walls, could not. To refuse all contact was to choose a different kind of poverty, a stagnation of tools, ideas, and ultimately, security. When he stood to address the new council, his position was not one of weakness or supplication. He met the foreign emissaries not in a throne room, but at the council's oak table, with the blacksmith and the healer seated beside him. He accepted their diplomatic overtures, but the terms were his own. Dor-Lómin would not become a vassal or a tributary. They would trade, but for specific goods they lacked, quality steel for their plows, and advanced medical knowledge from southern healers. The alliance would be one of mutual respect, a pact between equals, not of a lord and his subject. His negotiation established their independence not through defiance, but through the unshakable confidence of those who have already faced their end and remade themselves from the ashes. The agreement was a triumph, a gateway to a future of growth and greater safety. But as the first southern trade wagons rolled into the courtyard, laden with unfamiliar goods and even more unfamiliar faces, a new, more subtle chapter began. The world was now inside their gates, with all its promises and its unspoken complexities. They had secured their independence, but they now had to learn how to wield it in a world of shifting alliances and foreign interests, a game far more intricate than any they had played before. The scratch of the scribe's quill was the only sound in the quiet room. Aryan had gathered not only the learned scribes, but also the blacksmith, the lead healer, and the farmer who had saved the harvest. Their task was to begin the annals of Hador anew, but this history would be written with different ink. It would record the names of every soul who fell during the siege, from the highest captain to the young apprentice who carried water until the moment a collapsing wall took her. The project was not born from a desire for glory, but from a profound need to give meaning to the immense suffering they had all endured. By turning their shared memory into a permanent legacy, they were building a monument more enduring than any statue, one made of words and witness. Deciding which stories to tell, however, became its own quiet battle. The scribes, trained in the old ways, instinctively focused on troop movements and Lord Aerion's decisive commands. But the farmer interrupted, his voice firm. He insisted they record the day the bakers used the last of the clean flour to make small, hard loaves for the children on the walls, and the night the weavers tore their own cloaks for bandages. These were the deeds that had truly held their world together. The most difficult tension arose over how to frame the darker chapters, the desperate choices that still carried the sting of shame. Some council members argued to soften the account of Lord Valandil's betrayal, to frame it as a tragic flaw rather than a calculated act. Others wanted to gloss over Baron's initial, costly recklessness at the river, remembering only his final, heroic sacrifice. Aryan listened to the debate, his gaze resting on the blank vellum that would become their first page. His decision was as foundational as any law he had decreed. He declared that the annals would be a record of learning, not just glory. They would tell the full, unvarnished truth, his own moments of doubt, the agonizing hesitation before ordering the retreat from the outer wall, his private fear in the council chamber. All of it would be set down alongside his resolve. And Baron's story would be told in full, a chronicle of a fiery temper transformed into steadfast loyalty, a narrative of redemption that was far more valuable than a tale of flawless virtue. This commitment to honesty, however painful, raised the stakes of their endeavor immeasurably. They were not just recording events, they were forging their collective conscience. As the first words were finally penned with solemn care, the project began to heal wounds that physical labor could not reach. A soldier who had lost a brother found a strange comfort in seeing his name written beside the description of his brave stand. A mother who had mourned in silence saw her daughter's small, forgotten act of kindness immortalized, and her grief slowly began to transform into a fierce, proud sorrow. This honest history became the moral bedrock of the new Hador. It taught everyone that resilience was not the absence of failure, but the will to rise from it, and that a legacy's true strength lies in its willingness to remember every scar. The annals ensured that future generations would not inherit a sanitized myth, but a living, breathing guide to the terrible and beautiful cost of their survival. The first frost of winter had settled on Aryan's shoulders, not just in the chill air, but deep within his bones. He stood before the full council in the great hall, his movements slower, his once booming voice now a weathered instrument. He spoke not of policy or harvests, but of his own body's betrayal, the old wounds from the siege that now ached with every passing season. Then he delivered a pronouncement that silenced the room more completely than any enemy war cry. He would not name his successor. The next leader of their people would be chosen by the council, he declared, selected from among the most capable of them all, with no regard for noble blood or family name. The title of Lord would not be inherited, it would be earned. This was the final, necessary break with the world that was. The announcement sent a shockwave through the community, rippling out from the hall into every workshop and field. In the days that followed, the society became a living debate. In the communal kitchens, cooks argued over whether a leader needed the wisdom of age or the vigor of youth. The blacksmiths, hammering at their forges, debated if practical skill with metal was a better qualification than knowledge of letters and law. The very idea of leadership was being pulled apart and reassembled in the image of their new world. It was a healthy, necessary ferment, but it carried a sharp edge of tension. Soon, distinct candidates emerged from the discourse, each representing a different path forward. There was Kalen, the master architect, who had overseen the fortress's ingenious redesign, a man of brilliant plans and meticulous detail, who believed Hador's future lay in ever stronger, smarter defenses and structured trade. Then there was Lyra, the young head of the Healers Guild, whose compassion during the siege had been legendary. She argued for a future focused inward, on strengthening their community bonds, expanding their medical knowledge, and fostering the arts. And from the Council of Farmers came Torvin, a pragmatic man of few words who believed that all other concerns were secondary to the land itself, to securing their food supply and mastering the stubborn, reclaimed soil. Each faction gathered supporters, their debates filling the council chamber with passionate, sometimes heated, appeals. Aryan watched it all unfold from his seat, a silent, unreadable figure. Many expected him to throw his support behind one candidate, to offer a nod or a word that would settle the matter, but he remained steadfastly neutral. He believed with every fiber of his conviction that for their new ideals to take root, the people in their council had to find their own leader. His silence was his final, greatest lesson in letting go. The stakes of this peaceful deliberation were higher than any military engagement they had faced. This was the ultimate test of whether their society, forged in the fires of shared sacrifice, could now navigate the transfer of power without fracturing. Could they choose a leader without an enemy to unite against? The council began its formal deliberations behind closed doors, the weight of their entire experiment resting on their ability to listen, to compromise, and to see the best path forward, not for one family, but for one people. The council chamber remained sealed for 3 days and 3 nights. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open, the faces of the delegates were etched with a profound and weary resolution. They did not announce a new Lord or Lady of Hador. They announced their choice for first speaker, and the name that echoed through the hushed great hall was Alara. The decision was a quiet revolution. The people, gathered in the courtyard, did not cheer with the fervor of a military victory, but with a deep, resonant murmur of approval. They saw in Alara the one who had ventured into myth to bring back their hope, the calm voice in the war council who had argued for the wisdom of the heart. Her selection was a final, definitive statement that the strength of their people now resided in foresight and healing, not merely in the edge of a sword. Yet from a corner near the armory, a handful of grizzled veterans stood with arms crossed, their silence a low rumble of dissent. They had fought and bled alongside Aryan, and in their hearts, they believed that only a warrior, a queen who could wield a blade with terrifying skill, could truly stand as a deterrent against the world's returning shadows. They feared that this choice of a scholar, a diplomat, signaled a dangerous softness, a vulnerability that their future enemies would not hesitate to exploit. When the council formally offered her the role, Alara's acceptance redefined its very nature. She would not take the high seat at the head of the hall. She would sit among them as one voice of many. She was not a ruler to command, but a first speaker to guide, to synthesize their many perspectives into a single, clear direction for their people. This was not a rejection of authority, but a transformation of it, shifting its foundation from birthright to earned trust and collective consent. The moment of the pledge was the true test. One by one, the council members, then the guild leaders, and finally every citizen in the courtyard stepped forward. They did not kneel to swear fealty to a monarch. They stood tall, looking their new first speaker in the eye, and pledged their loyalty to her and to the council she represented. It was a vow not of subservience, but of mutual responsibility. This peaceful, deliberate transfer of power was the ultimate proof that their new society could endure. It was not held together by the force of a single personality, but by the strength of a shared ideal. The system they had built in the ashes had passed its most difficult trial, not with a clash of steel, but with the quiet, unshakable power of a collective choice. The polished face of the ancient shield caught the morning light, its surface no longer marred by battle, but etched with the new emblem of the green shoot. Aryan held it not as a weapon, but as a vessel, its weight a familiar pressure in his hands. He stood before Alara in the center of the council circle, the entire community of Hador arrayed around them in a silent, watchful ring. There were no grand pronouncements, no fanfare of trumpets. He simply extended the shield, his eyes meeting hers in a look of profound understanding and trust. She accepted it with a slow, deliberate nod, her hands closing around the worn leather grips. Then, without a single word of instruction or advice, Aryan turned and walked the few paces to an empty seat among the blacksmiths and the farmers. He sat down, becoming just another voice in the chorus of his people. The sheer simplicity of the act, a lord voluntarily dissolving his own authority to join the governed, was more humbling and powerful than any coronation could ever be. In the quiet that followed, you could feel the old world finally, completely, come to an end. For Aryan, that silence was a roaring in his ears. The council's discussion began, a debate about the allocation of timber for the new bridge, and his first instinct was to stand, to cut through the chatter with a decisive order. His muscles tensed with the memory of command, a lifetime of habit screaming to be heard. He had to consciously force his hands to unclench on his knees, to keep his seat and simply listen. It was a battle fought entirely within, a struggle against the very instincts that had kept them all alive. He watched Alara guide the discussion, her style patient and inquisitive, drawing out opinions he would have overlooked. He saw the wisdom in it, the way it built a consensus that was stronger than any decree. In that moment, he made a quiet, personal vow. He would not be a ghost of authority haunting her new reign. He would learn a new kind of strength, the strength of silence, of support. He committed himself to the role of counselor and memory keeper, a living archive of their shared pain and triumphs, offering his hard-won experience only when she asked for it, ensuring her leadership was never overshadowed by his legend. This graceful, internal surrender was the final, necessary stone laid in the foundation of their new society. By willingly stepping into the ranks, Aryan completed the transformation of Hador from a feudal house ruled by one man's will into a true community of shared responsibility. His greatest work was no longer to command, but to ensure that no single person would ever have to bear such a terrible burden alone again. The Heartstone was placed in the dead of night, its surface cool and dark as river rock. They lowered it into the foundation of the new great hall with ropes and quiet hands, settling it into the earth where the main support pillar would rise. There was no chant, no ceremony, no gathering of the entire community. Only Alara and the Master Mason were present, along with the two surviving rangers who had carried it back from the wilderness. Its light was utterly gone, its great power spent in that single, blinding moment that had broken the siege. Now it was just a stone, heavy and silent, becoming the literal bedrock of their new beginning. The next morning, as the builders began laying the first courses of stone around it, a quiet debate stirred among the council. One of the younger scouts, a man who had seen the stone's miracle firsthand, voiced the hope that others secretly shared. Could they not find a way to reawaken it? He argued that such a power should not be allowed to sleep, that it could be a permanent shield for their people, a light to keep all future shadows at bay. It was a plea born of a fear that had not fully healed, a desire for a simple, absolute answer to the complex problem of safety. Alara listened, her hands resting on the cool, inert stone. Her response was gentle, but held the weight of hard-won wisdom. She told them that to try and force the stone back to life would be to misunderstand its entire purpose. Its power was not meant to be a permanent crutch, a weapon they could store in their armory. Its true gift was the hope it gave them in their darkest hour, the chance it bought them to save themselves. To try and reignite it now would be an act of fear, not of strength. It would mean they had learned nothing from their ordeal, that they still looked for salvation from an object rather than from each other. Her decision was final. The stone would remain as it was, a quiet monument to sacrifice, not a tool to be wielded. This choice carried immense stakes for their future. By leaving the stone dormant, they were consciously choosing a path of vulnerability. They were declaring that their security would not be magically assured, but would have to be earned every single day through the strength of their community, the sharpness of their watchfulness, and the depth of their trust in one another. The great hall rose slowly and solidly around that silent cornerstone, its walls a testament to their own labor and will. They were building their future not on a relic's fading power, but on the memory of what they had overcome together, a foundation that no shadow could ever truly corrupt. The great loom's rhythmic clacking became the new heartbeat of Dor-Lómin. It was the weavers, those who had mended the very fabric of their clothes during the darkest days, who first proposed a new kind of chronicle. Inspired by the honest words of the new annals, they began a tapestry so vast it would cover an entire wall of the rebuilt Great Hall. But this was not a record of lords on horseback. The first figure woven into the cloth was not Aryan, but the baker's wife, her arms laden with the small, hard loaves she had given to the children on the walls. Next to her appeared the young mason, his face determined as he stacked stones with bleeding hands. The project quickly outgrew the Weavers' Guild. It became a communal act of remembrance. A farmer would come forward with a scrap of his child's tunic, a piece of cloth salvaged from the ruins, and ask for it to be stitched into the border near the image of the harvest. An old guardsman, his eyes clouded with memory, would point to a section depicting the final assault, and with a needle and thread provided by the weavers, add a single, deliberate stitch to the figure of a fallen comrade, literally weaving himself into the history of his people. This act of collective creation, however, forced difficult conversations. As the tapestry grew, so did the debates over which stories deserved a place on the wall. Some argued passionately for including the moment of Baron's glorious, foolish charge at the river. Others, their voices hushed with pain, countered that it was his final, sacrificial distraction that truly defined his legacy. The most heated discussions centered on the darker threads of their past. Should the figure of Lord Valondil the traitor, be woven in at all. To omit him would be to lie about the nature of their fear, but to include him felt like honoring a betrayal. The community had to continually reflect on what their shared values truly were, deciding whether their history would be a monument to perfection or a map of their hard-won humanity. Elara watched these debates with a quiet intensity. She saw that the true power of the tapestry was not in its completion, but in its endless becoming. She made a decree that settled the matter for all time. The Great Tapestry, she announced, would never be considered finished. It would continue to grow, panel by panel, as their society did. New stories of peace, of trade, of children born in safety would be added alongside the old tales of war. The loom's shuttle would never rest. This decision ensured that the memory of their collective struggle and the fragile principle that every life contributes to the whole would remain the central pillar of their identity for generations to come. The tapestry became a living, breathing entity, a silent teacher for every child who looked upon it, a reminder that their story was not a relic locked in the past, but a fabric they were all still weaving together with every choice they made. The scent of roasting venison and baking bread could not entirely mask the subtle tensions in the great hall. The first formal mood of allies had gathered in Dor-Lómin, a sea of colorful cloaks and unfamiliar accents. First speaker, Elara moved among the visiting dignitaries from the southern kingdoms and the eastern hill clans, her calm presence a quiet anchor in the swirling currents of diplomacy. She had arranged the council circle not with a high seat for herself, but with all delegates on equal footing, a deliberate echo of Hador's own transformation. The initial discussions were productive, fostering swift agreements on mutual defense pacts and the mapping of new trade routes that promised prosperity for the entire region. Knowledge, too, was shared, with southern healers offering their texts in exchange for Hador's hard-won wisdom on cleansing blighted land. The stability they were building felt tangible, a fortress of cooperation rising stone by stone. But old rivalries, older than the shadow that had recently plagued them, are not so easily buried. The trouble began during a debate over the patrol schedules for the shared mountain passes. Lord Aerion of the Southern Kingdom, a man with a hawkish nose and a pride to match, made a pointed remark about the unreliability of the Eastern Hill clans, a reference to a generations-old dispute over mining rights. The chieftain of those clans, a sturdy woman named Anya, shot to her feet, her voice sharp as flint. The room grew cold, the fragile harmony of the morning threatening to shatter into 1,000 bitter pieces. Elara did not raise her voice. She listened, her gaze moving from Aerion's flushed face to Anya's rigid posture. She saw not just two stubborn leaders, but the deep-seated fear beneath their anger, a fear of being cheated, of being disrespected, of seeing their people left vulnerable once more. Using her skills as a mediator and the subtle foresight that had always guided her, she did not take a side. Instead, she reframed the entire problem. She asked them to consider the mountain not as a line to be defended or a prize to be claimed, but as a shared spine that kept the entire body of their alliance upright. A weakness in one part, she suggested gently, would make the whole structure frail. She then proposed a joint guardianship of the passes, with mixed patrols from both their peoples, forcing cooperation and fostering the very trust that was lacking. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, By positioning Hador not as a ruling power, but as an honest bridge, she gave neither side a victory, yet secured a victory for all. Thuron and Anya, disarmed by her impartial wisdom and the sheer logic of the proposal, slowly, reluctantly, nodded their agreement. The pledges of lasting friendship that concluded the moot were not hollow words. They were bonds forged in the recognition that Hador's greatest strength was no longer its walls, but its ability to see the connections between others. The influence of the mended shield now spread across the land, a quiet, persistent force for peace, built not on the fear of a sword, but on the power of a compelling example. Dawn on the anniversary arrived not with fanfare, but with a deep and deliberate quiet. The entire community, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, gathered in the courtyard before the great memorial stone. No words were spoken, no orders given. They simply stood together as the sun crested the mountains, its light touching the names carved into the stone, Baron, and all the countless others who had given everything. The shared silence was a tangible presence, a communal meditation on the sheer weight of their loss and the staggering price of their continued existence. For hours, the only sounds were the wind and the soft rustle of clothing as people shifted their weight. This was not a celebration of victory, but a raw, unvarnished acknowledgement of the void left behind. The grief, even years later, was a current running just beneath the surface of their daily lives, and on this day, it was allowed to rise, painful and undeniable. Tears traced paths through the dust on a veteran's face. A mother's hand trembled as she laid a single, wildflower on the stone. The emotional toll was immense, a necessary reopening of a wound that had never fully healed, a reminder that some scars are carried not on the skin, but on the soul. In the midst of the crowd, Aryan and Alara stood side by side. They did not stand on a platform or at the head of the gathering. They were simply two more mourners in a sea of grief, their own private sorrows for a lost cousin, and a shattered past woven into the collective tapestry of pain. They shared the burden of memory not as leaders, but as kin, their silent presence a testament that no one, not even they, carried this weight alone. This annual ritual, this quiet vigil, was the anchor of their new society. It ensured that the comfort of peace, the bounty of the harvest, and the warmth of the hearth would never be taken for granted. The cost was remembered here, in this profound silence, binding every heart in the community with a solemn and unbreakable gratitude. As the sun finally began to set, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold, the long silence was broken. It was not by a speech or a cheer, but by a single, clear, and hopeful note from a lone flute, a fragile thread of music rising into the twilight, promising that after remembrance, life must always begin again. The wind on the wall was gentle, carrying the scent of fresh bread from the ovens below and the distant sound of children laughing in the new gardens. Aryan, his hair the color of winter frost, stood beside his sister, his hand resting on the sun-warmed stone of the battlement. His gaze traveled over the bustling courtyards, the smoke rising from peaceful hearths, and the vibrant green of the reclaimed fields stretching to the horizon. This was the peace he had almost failed to imagine in the years of smoke and blood. He reached out, his fingers gnarled and scarred, brushing against the fabric of the banner, flying overhead. The green enameled shoot seemed to pulse with life in the midday light, a stark contrast to the mended threads of the old hawk beneath it. He had spent his youth believing a legacy was something you defended, a glory to be preserved behind high walls and held aloft on a battlefield. He had raised his banner in defiance, thinking that was the pinnacle of his house's strength. But the defiance had only been the beginning, the necessary breaking before the true making could start. The real rise of Hador, he understood now with a clarity that settled deep in his old bones, was not in that first, proud shout against the dark. It was in the 1,000 quiet choices that followed, the stubborn decision to pick up the stones, to plant the seeds in poisoned soil, to listen to the blacksmith and the farmer as if their words were gold. It was in the humility to mend what was broken, not to simply mourn its shattering. True strength was not a fortress, but a tapestry, and its most vital threads were the ones they had almost thrown away. He looked at Alara, her own face lined with the maps of their shared history, and then down at the people they served. Their strength was not his alone, nor was it locked in a relic or a bloodline. It lived in the unified heart of the community, a resilient, ever-changing song to which every single voice now contributed. The banner above him was no longer a symbol of a house, but of a promise kept, a future chosen, one humble, persistent stitch at a time. The last House of Hador endures, though its high walls now embrace a different kind of strength. Aryan, once a lord who commanded armies, now finds his greatest purpose in the quiet circle of listeners by the evening fire. He does not recount his own heroic deeds, but the small, forgotten acts of courage that truly saved them all, the story of the baker's wife or the mason's bleeding hands. His personal journey from ruler to citizen is the very soul of his house's transformation, a living testament that true power is found in service, not in command. Beside him, Alara guides their future with a quiet wisdom that was forged in the furnace of their shared suffering. Her leadership is a subtle thing, a gentle pressure on the tiller that keeps their community on a steady course, always mindful of the deep waters they have navigated. The banner that flies above them, its hawk interwoven with the green shoot, is no longer a claim of dominion over the land. It is a testament, a promise kept to the fallen and to each other. It whispers of the choice they make every single day, to remember the cost, to honor the struggle, and to always find the courage to build anew from the pieces left behind. Their legacy is not a monument, but a method, a living idea that from the deepest ruin can grow a community more resilient than any